She's the prize-winning author of a crime novel, Déjà Dead, probably because, and I'm just guessing, because she's a forensic anthropologist working in the office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Charlotte, North Carolina, and in the Laboratoire des Sciences Judiciaires et de Médecine Légale pour la Province de Québec. She is Kathy Reichs. And just before I bring her up here, I want to tell you something that was told to me by a very fetching-looking gal who said that she was coming over to report on behalf of a group of her friends, and having thoroughly discussed it, they've arrived at a consensus. The scientists are the new studs. Kathy?
I thought what I would do is talk to you. There are two questions that I get more often than anything else. One is, where do you get your ideas for your books? And I always say I'm still a practicing forensic anthropologist, so I derive my ideas from stories, from cases that I've worked on. And I can tell the person to whom I'm speaking gets this vision of Margaret Mead or Louis Leakey or Jane Goodall, and they can't figure out for the life of them what that would have to do with crime writing. So the second question is always, what the hell is a forensic anthropologist? So I thought I would talk today about what it is I do, and then how I take from what I do story ideas for writing fiction. And how do we go to the screen? Okay. We are a subset of anthropology. I'm a physical anthropologist. I trained to do archaeology. I didn't stay at that very long. Because I was the bones expert, police started bringing cases to me. And once I started doing coroner work, I found that very compelling, and I really haven't looked back since. There are three phases that I think of as forensic anthropology, and these, of course, are the same things that my heroine, Tempe Brennan, gets involved in her novels. Recovery, and that would take place in the field, and there are two different situations I'll mention. Identification, who is the person that's been brought to the coroner, to the morgue, and then what happened to that person, analysis of trauma. Those are the three main things that I address. First of all, I get cases every year that might not even be human cases. So the first thing I would have to determine is it human? Is it not human? How long has the person been dead? Generally, if they've been dead more than 25 years or so, it's not going to be of much forensic interest, although there are, of course, exceptions. Who is this person? What happened to them? And in some cases, what happened to them after they were dead? A lot of people are found by hikers, by people walking through parks, by dogs, by hunters, by fishermen. Those would be the kinds of cases that I would go out into the field with an official crime scene recovery unit. I do not do some of the things my character does. I do not go off and dig up bodies on my own. The second situation would be where there's been a court order, a coroner's requested, a family has requested an exhumation, a formal exhumation from a cemetery. This slide is actually taken from a case that I did with a fellow named Mike Bodden, who some of you may know. He's probably the highest profile pathologist in North America. He did, well, he was OJ's pathologist, for example. Go figure. So Michael and I we did one case this very same year up about 400 miles north of Montreal. It was 30 below zero. And then we did a case in Kansas that you see here. It was 104 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. So we had all kinds of conditions. It's very popular right now among forensic anthropologists, by the way, to kind of dig up the dead but famous Lizzie Borden and former presidents and that sort of thing. I haven't done a lot of that myself. I was involved in one case in Europe I thought of this morning as I was listening to the pianist. They thought they'd found the remains of Mozart, and I was asked to come over and look at that. And typically what we do when we get the coffin out of the ground, we don't open it there. We take it to the autopsy room, and we do photographs and x-rays and whatever. And we did that in this case, and Then we finally opened it. There's a lot of sheet music, which was very exciting to the ethnomusicologist that was on the team. A lot of sheet music in the coffin. And Mozart was very well preserved. He was sort of holding a writing implement of some kind. And as we were doing the preliminary photos, his hand was jerking, and this writing implement would move across the sheet music, and it was actually erasing notes. Mozart was decomposing right. Okay. Once, I won't do that again. I'm not going to try. I was saying to someone this morning, why do I have to go on a day when everybody's been so funny? I'm not going to be very funny. Once we've figured out it's human and we take it back to the lab, in determining who it is, I don't do very many positive IDs. That would be done by dental remains or DNA. But I'm the first stage of entry often because we have no idea who it is. And as my first book opens, they found the decomposed body on the grounds of the Grand Séminaire in downtown Montreal. And I haven't heard from the church fathers how they feel about that, but I'm sure I will. The first step is to take those remains and figure out the age, the sex, the race, all of those things so that the detective can then go through the missing persons files and try to figure out who it is. So we look at things, for example, on the skull in a male, these brow ridges would be bigger. The mastoid process here would be bigger. The bump at the back of the skull would be bigger. Essentially, all of the muscle attachment areas in the male are bigger. The male of the species often has bigger ideas as well, but these are rarely survive the decomposition process. They often don't survive the 11 o'clock news, but that's another story. Determining age is a lot easier with children who are still growing. Once you get to be adult, it's more difficult. We look at what you're seeing on the top. That's the two halves of the pelvis where they meet in front. The ribs develop long attachments as you grow older. Determining race can be very difficult. Really, the only areas that are of much use are the skull portions, and we tend to talk in terms of the big three, even though recognizing race is a much more complicated concept than that. The other area, that third area, in addition to recovery and ID, would be blunt trauma analysis, looking at patterns of fracture in the bone to try to figure out what happened to this person. How many blows, what kind of instrument was used to hit the person, what was the sequence of the blows, if it was a sharp instrument, what kind, was it a knife, was it a saw, was it double-edged, etc. The case on the lower left is a fellow Michael Bodden and I worked on as well, a government commission in Quebec. This was a policeman that had died back in the 1960s. The family had always felt it was suicide, was homicide, whereas the original report said suicide. So we exhumed the body, looked at the bones. The question was, did the bullet enter in the front and exit in the back, or was it the other way around? And we were actually able to determine that's a classic front to back bullet hole, so it was quite consistent with suicide. So that would be a typical kind of case that I look at, and that my heroine, Tempe Brennan, would look at. My first book came out back in 1997. This is the one that Moses mentioned that won the Arthur Ellis Award. I never, for both legal and ethical reasons, use actual cases or actual names or actual people or places. I change everything, but I do take my core ideas for writing the fiction from this. And I think this was mentioned by a number of speakers during the conference, is that it's my way, I suppose my idea is to take my science and get it out to a much broader public. And this is my way of doing that. I'm absolutely fanatical about keeping the science precise in my books, so that if my readers read them and they think they've learned a little bit about DNA or something, they actually have. Déjà Dead was based very loosely on a serial murder case back in 1994 in Montreal. This fellow, Serge Archambault, was arrested after having killed his second victim. At that time, he admitted to having killed another woman 2 years earlier, having cut her up and buried her in 5 locations across the St. Lawrence River. If you don't read French, by the way, le psychopathe, that means the psychopath. So, Monsieur Archambault, what was interesting in this case, and what the arrows are showing you, are the cut marks. Monsieur Archambault, I looked at this case, and often in a saw dismemberment case or any kind of dismemberment case, what might be of interest is the kind of tool that was used. What you see on the lower right there, that was a lady that floated ashore in 2 different jurisdictions in West Virginia who'd actually been killed in Ohio. And she had been dismembered with 2 different kinds of implements. The arrow is pointing to a saw mark, which tends to be a little bit more square when you see it magnified, and that's a knife mark. But what was of interest in the Archambault case and what I was able to tell police is the way he did it, the manner in which he did it. He had gone directly into the joints, cut his victim up in a way that showed a great deal of skill about anatomy. Typically, when you dismember somebody, well, not when you dismember somebody, but when a perpetrator dismembers, they're just going to cut off above or below the joints. But this gentleman had gone right into the joints, and I suggested he knew something about anatomy. He was either a butcher or perhaps an orthopedic surgeon. I was giving a talk. I was talking about this case to the American Orthopedic Association, and I mentioned this. And I said he was either a butcher, an orthopedic surgeon, or both. And they, it got a laugh among the orthopedists. So as it turned out, Mr. Archambault had in fact been a butcher throughout part of his illustrious career. So that turned out to be a rather telling piece of testimony in the trial. He's now serving 3 life sentences. My second book, Death du Jour, came out 2 years later in 1999. Death du Jour was based on a couple of cases. I was hired by the Catholic Church, by the Archdiocese of Montreal, to exhume and analyze the remains of a woman named Jeanne Lebert. And she had died in 1714. Jeanne Lebert was a well-known historic figure. She was known as the Recluse of Montreal. At the age of 18, she asked her parents, I guess, to be able to lock herself away in her room, which she did until she was 34 years old. Her parents then made a large donation to the church. Jeanne was allowed to move into the convent, which still stands, and she lived there in seclusion until she died at age 52. So we exhumed, and she's been proposed for sainthood. So one of the first steps in the canonization process is to be sure you have the right person. So we exhumed her skeleton and looked at everything, and everything was consistent. But the case got me to thinking about, why would a young woman do that? Why would she lock herself away for her entire life because of a commitment to an ideology? That same year, she had some interesting characteristics of her teeth. She spent all of her time sewing and praying, and we found the arthritis in the knees and in her toes from the kneeling and presumably praying. And then we found grooving in her teeth from year after year of pulling the thread through for the sewing. So in addition to the profile, everything was consistent. That same year, in a little village, Morin Heights, outside of Montreal, there was a fire. And when firemen went in, they found the badly burned bodies of an adult male and an adult female, and those came to our lab for autopsy. Sure. Not long after that, in an unburned, several days later, in an unburned portion of the house, firefighters went in and they found the unburned remains of an adult male, an adult female, and a 3-month-old infant. As it turned out, those were the first victims of the Order of the Solar Temple, the cult in which to date 74 people have died in Quebec and in France and Switzerland. So again, that got me thinking about cults and why people make those kinds of decisions, how cults control the behavior of their members, how they regulate right down to thought processes, how they actually get people to kill each other and to kill themselves. And I started looking into it, and we have had quite a spate of those in North America. We had the Heaven's Gate people out in San Diego. We had the Branch Davidians at Waco, Texas. We had the People's Temple folks down in Guyana with Jim Jones in South America. So the theme running through my second book then has to do with cults and thought processes and controlling and recruiting into cults. In each of my books, I use what I think of as a core science, some bit of science In the first one, it was saw marks and cut marks in bone. In the second one, it was these guys, entomology. I work as part of a team that teaches at the FBI Academy in Quantico, and we teach special agents how to recover human remains. One of my team members is an entomologist, so I have the advantage of being able to call on my colleagues when I have questions. Flies, when a body dies, flies are basically, I don't know, they're basically looking for what we're looking for. They're looking for a good neighborhood, nice housing, good place to raise the kids, good supermarkets, that sort of thing. And a body is perfect. So flies are going to invade a body very quickly. They then, the females lay their eggs. The eggs go through 3 stages of development. And then at about adolescence, flies, kids do what our kids do. They abandon home. And they form a puparal casing. And their molecules do what we hope our kids' molecules will do. They completely reorganize, and then the fly comes out as an adult. I have 2 kids that have made it through and one that I'm still hoping. So if you know something about the stage of the insects, if you know something about what you've got at your crime scene, you can determine how long an individual has been dead. So that's one of the things that I use in Death du jour. You learn probably a bit more than you ever wanted to know about maggots and flies. Maggots are really very fascinating little creatures. There's now research going on, and you are what you eat. So if you look at the maggots, if maggots have been feeding on a body of a chronic drug user, can you get the drugs out of the maggots? Can you get the DNA? If you don't even have a body, but you've got a few maggots, can you get the DNA of the person that whose body was lying there? So I think it's pretty interesting stuff. Deadly Decisions was my 3rd book. And in this one, the cover is actually derived. I also teach a body recovery workshop for the RCMP in Ottawa, for the Canadian Police College. And the fellow that brings me over there is a blood spatter pattern analysis expert. And that's hard to say. Say that 3 times quickly. So I decided I wanted to use blood spatter pattern analysis in this book. And this is actually a photograph that was taken and modified greatly, but taken from a crime scene. We have a real interesting subcultural group working over in Quebec. We have the only active biker war in the world right now. The Hells Angels are slugging it out with a group called the Rock Machine, but the Rock Machine has now patched over and are members of the of one of the big 4, the Banditos. So they've been slugging it out over control of the drug trade. So I've gotten, and I'm not going to translate, FTW kind of sums up the philosophy of these folks. If you want me to translate that, I'll be glad to do that, but not from the podium. So I've had a number of their victims. One of their MOs is to kill someone and then torch the car. That's a typical forensic anthropology type of case. You have an unidentifiable body. You might think, well, let them shoot each other out. It's a cheap means of social control. They're kind of, take out both sides and that'll be done with it. But there are also innocent victims. This was a 17-year-old girl that began running around with bikers and turned up dead 9 years later as a result of that. So the Cockajou unit was formed in 1997, I believe it was. It was the result of the death of an innocent young boy. I spent a lot of time for this book researching with the Cockajou unit. Blood spatter pattern can tell you where your victim was, how they were hit, how many times you were hit. This, for example, is active transfer as the victim fell. This is passively falling blood. This, by the way, is the type of blood you can see in the original crime scenes on Nicole Brown Simpson's body that would have told us the DNA of the perpetrator. Unfortunately, she was moved, turned on her back, and that blood was lost. Fatal Voyage is my 4th book. I'm part of the DMORT team. DMORT teams are brought in by the federal government in cases of disaster, and we help identify victims and recover victims. Typically, we work at plane crashes. I spent 2 weeks this past fall working at the World Trade Center. That's me out at the landfill. This is probably the worst 2 weeks of my life. I could identify very much with the speaker earlier today that was talking about how very personal and how very difficult an experience it is to talk about. But my 4th book has Tempe at a plane crash. She's with her DMORT team. This is a case I had in Montreal in which a foot, just a lone foot, turned up. And I had to, it gave me the idea, well, what do you do if you have a body part that doesn't belong where it's found? And that's what happens to Tempe as she's looking at that case. My new book will be out on July 9th. It's called Grave Secrets. It derives from some human rights work I was involved in Guatemala. I went down there and helped exhume a mass grave up in the highlands. This has gotten into the paper a lot lately because most of the members of the human rights team with whom I worked down there have subsequently received death threats, and many of them in the last couple of weeks have left. We worked, one of the women that would come from the village every day to watch us had 9 grandchildren and her 4 daughters in the pit that we were exhuming. So that forms the backdrop of the book that's about to come out. It's also based partly on a case I did of a Canadian who went down to visit the Mayan ruins from an archaeological interest and was killed while down there. I was asked 9 years later to help identify her remains that had been found in a septic tank behind her hotel in Belize City. So like most of my books, Grave Secrets also has 2 stories operating on 2 different levels. Another question I often get is, aren't you afraid you're going to run out of ideas? This is my warehouse at the Laboratoire de Sciences Judiciaires de Médecine Légale in Montreal. These are all cases. Each one is a person, each one is a story. And I draw on these to write my fiction. So I guess my idea is what's been mentioned by a number of other people here already, bringing science to the public, bringing it in a painless way, in my case through fiction, but trying to make the public more aware of science and what it is that we can do with science. And that is pretty much the end, because I see my red light on. If you're interested in forensic anthropology, or you're interested in looking more at any of these things, you can see links to the FBI, to DMORT, to FEMA, to the various places that I work, the military laboratory out in Hawaii, on my website. Thank you.